The day Florence Slater stood in the Kansas dust with her 11-year-old brother clinging to her skirt, and no money in her purse, and no roof over their heads, was the day she understood that love and desperation were sometimes the same feeling wearing different clothes. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell, Kansas, was not a gentle town. It sat along the Kishom Trail like a splinter under the skin of the frontier, full of cattle drivers and gamblers, and men who had shed their better natures somewhere south of the Red River. Florence had arrived on the noon stage with Tommy beside her and a carpetbag that held everything the two of them owned in the world, which amounted to 2 changes of clothes, a tin photograph of their mother, and $3.40 in coins. Their mother, Clara Slater, had passed from a lung fever back in Missouri not 6 weeks before. Their father had been dead since the war. Florence was 22 years old and Tommy was 11, and there was no other family to speak of, which meant that every decision that needed making fell squarely on Florence's shoulders alone. She had come to Caldwell because she had heard there was work for women willing to cook and take in laundry, and she was willing to do both. She had heard there was a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holt, and she had composed a letter to Mrs. Holt before leaving Missouri, and Mrs. Holt had written back saying she could start immediately at a wage of $4 a week plus room and board for one. Room and board for one. Florence stood on the main street of Caldwell with the wind pulling at her bonnet strings and reread that part of Mrs. Holt's letter in her mind, and her stomach turned over like a stone being flipped in a cold creek. 1, not 2. She had known it when she got the letter, and she had told herself she would figure something out, and she had believed it the way you believe things when the alternative is too dark to look at directly. Mrs. Holt's boarding house was a narrow 2-story building on Cedar Street, painted white once and now the color of old teeth. Mrs. Holt herself was a small woman with sharp eyes and a kindness that lived behind a practical exterior, and she received Florence in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and a look that said she understood more than Florence had spoken aloud. "I can see you are in a difficult position," Mrs. Holt said, folding her hands around her own cup. "And I am not an unfeeling woman, but the fact remains that my arrangement was for one boarder and the boy takes up space and eats food and I run a tight house. I cannot take on 2 for the price of 1. I would work twice as hard," Florence said. "I would take on the laundry as well as the cooking. I am a good worker, Mrs. Holt. Tommy is a good boy. He is quiet and he does not cause trouble." Mrs. Holt looked at Tommy, who was sitting very straight in a kitchen chair with his hands folded in his lap, trying so hard to be invisible that it nearly broke Florence's heart in half. "I have no doubt he is," Mrs. Holt said, "but I cannot house him, Miss Slater. I am sorry." That is the plain truth of it. Florence paid for 2 nights at a rate Mrs. Holt was generous enough to offer her, and then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her small room with Tommy asleep on the floor beside her, rolled in one of the blankets off the bed, and she thought about what on earth she was going to do. The next morning she made inquiries. She spoke to the woman who ran the general store, to the schoolteacher, to the minister at the small church on the edge of town. Everyone was kind, and no one had an answer. The town was not an easy place for a woman alone, and a woman with a child she could barely feed was in a harder spot still. It was the schoolteacher, a slight man named Mr. Abernethy, who mentioned the name. "There is a rancher outside of town," Mr. Abernethy said. "Man named Elijah Shelby. Runs the Shelby spread about 4 miles east on the creek road. He is a decent man and a fair employer. He takes on hands, and I have heard he has had young men working for him before, learning the trade. He might have some need of a boy to help around the place. He might consider a working arrangement of some kind." Florence wrote the name down in her mind like you write something on a slate when you know you will need it later and cannot afford to forget. Elijah Shelby. She found the Shelby ranch by walking 4 miles along the creek road in the late afternoon with Tommy beside her, their carpetbag left locked at Mrs. Holt's, carrying nothing but her determination and the last of her pride. The ranch was not grand, but it was solid, the kind of place built by hands that intended to stay. A long, low house of timber and adobe, a proper barn of weathered wood, 3 corrals and a smokehouse, and a garden gone mostly to seed for the season. Cattle grazed on the slope beyond the creek, their shapes dark against the dry, golden grass. A man was working at the fence of the near corral when Florence and Tommy came up the road. He was hammering a post back into place, his back to them, his hat pushed down against the afternoon sun. He was broad across the shoulders, and he moved with the easy economy of someone who had spent years doing hard work and had made peace with all of it. He heard them and turned. Elijah Shelby was 28 years old, though he carried something quieter than his age, a steadiness in his brown eyes that made him seem like a man who had already thought through most of the things worth thinking about and had come to a few conclusions. He had a strong jaw dark with several days of beard, and his face was weathered in the honest way that belonged to men who lived outdoors, and when he looked at Florence he looked at her directly, the way a person looks at someone they intend to actually see. "Afternoon," he said, and his voice was low and even like the creek in summer. "Good afternoon," Florence said. She was aware that she was dusty from 4 miles of road and that her dress had seen better days and that she was standing in front of this man essentially asking for help, which was the thing she hated most in the world. She lifted her chin. "My name is Florence Slater. This is my brother Thomas. I was told you might speak with me about a working arrangement." Elijah set down his hammer and pulled off one glove and looked at them both. His gaze moved to Tommy, who was looking at the horses in the corral with an expression of pure and complete awe. "Mr. Abernethy sent you?" Elijah asked. "He suggested I come, yes." Elijah was quiet for a moment, which Florence would later understand was simply how he was, a man who thought before he spoke and never felt the need to fill silence with noise. "Come up to the house," he said. "Coffee is still hot." The kitchen of the Shelby Ranch house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something else that was harder to name, a kind of order that did not come from fussiness, but from a man who cared about his surroundings even when no one was watching. It was clean. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace. There was a window that looked out toward the creek. Florence sat at the table and explained her situation with as little sentiment as she could manage, which was a considerable effort because the situation was entirely made of sentiment whether she liked it or not. She told him about their mother dying. She told him about coming to Caldwell. She told him about Mrs. Holt and the job and the room that was for one person. "I have a position that will keep me housed and fed," she said, "but I cannot keep Tommy with me. Mrs. Holt will not allow it, and I cannot afford to pay for separate lodging for him as well. I need a place where he can stay, and I would like for that place to be somewhere he can also be useful so that he earns his keep and does not feel like a burden. Tommy is a hard worker. He is not afraid of early mornings or hard work. He is 11 years old, and he is the best person I know." She stopped speaking because her voice was threatening to do something she would not allow it to do, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the window instead of at Elijah Shelby. Across the table, Elijah watched her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Tommy, who had been very quiet through the whole conversation, drinking the small cup of coffee that had been put in front of him with the serious attention of someone drinking something far more important. "You know anything about horses?" Elijah asked Tommy. Tommy's head came up. "No, sir, but I want to learn. I am not scared of them." "Not scared of them is a start," Elijah said. He looked back at Florence. "I have been needing someone to help with the horses and the chickens and the general running of the place. I am out on the range most days, and I could use a steady hand back here at the house to keep things in order, room and meals included. It would not be a wage to speak of to start, but in the spring when the cattle work picks up, I would see that he was paid fair for his labor." Florence felt something loosen in her chest that had been tied tight for 6 weeks. It felt almost like breathing again. "You would take him," she said. It was not quite a question. "I would take him," Elijah said. "On one condition." Florence waited. "You come out on Sundays," he said, "so the boy does not get lonely, and so I can tell you how he is getting along." It was such a reasonable condition that it took Florence a moment to realize how much it meant to her. That simple thing, the Sunday visit, the thread that would keep her connected to the brother she was having to leave behind. "I will come every Sunday," she said. "I promise it." Tommy moved into the Shelby ranch that same evening, which was not the plan but was simply what happened because they were already there. And Elijah showed him the small room off the kitchen that had a real bed in it, and Tommy looked at it like he had never seen anything so fine. Florence helped him put his few things away, and she sat on the edge of the bed with him for a long time after supper, talking quietly while Elijah made himself scarce in that considerate way of his. And when it was finally time for her to walk back to town, she held Tommy's face in her hands. "I am not leaving you," she said. "Sunday I will be here. Every Sunday. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded. His eyes were bright, but he was not crying, which meant he was working very hard not to cry. "Mr. Shelby seems all right," Tommy said. "He does," Florence agreed, and she meant it in a way that surprised her, because she had not expected to trust a stranger so quickly, but there was something about Elijah Shelby that was simply trustworthy, the way some rivers are simply cold, not because of anything you could see, but because of something deep in the source. She walked the 4 miles back to Caldwell in the dark, and she did not cry until she was in her room at Mrs. Holt's with the door closed. The first Sunday she went back, she brought a loaf of bread she had made in Mrs. Holt's kitchen at 5 in the morning, before anyone else was awake. She walked the 4 miles because there was no other way unless she borrowed a horse from someone, which she could not ask, and she did not mind the walking because each step was a step closer to Tommy, and that made it feel like nothing at all. She arrived to find Tommy in the corral with Elijah, learning to handle a lead rope with a roan mare that was patient enough to teach. Elijah's hands were over Tommy's hands on the rope, adjusting the grip, and Tommy was listening with his whole face the way he had always listened to things that interested him, which gave Florence a complicated feeling she did not examine too closely, because she was simply glad he was well. "You look different," she said to Tommy when he came running to meet her. "I have been outside," Tommy said. "Mr. Shelby says I have a natural feel for horses." Florence looked across the corral at Elijah, who had heard this and ducked his head in a way that might have been trying to hide a smile. "Does he?" she said. "He does," Tommy said, and led her toward the house with the total confidence of someone who had been living there for a week and had already decided it was home. The Sundays became the thing Florence lived toward all week. The work at Mrs. Holt's boarding house was hard, but she was used to hard work, and Mrs. Holt was a fair woman who did not make the work unpleasant. Florence cooked the meals and did the laundry and kept the rooms in order and smiled at the boarders when they came down to breakfast, and she saved her money with the precision of someone who had a plan, even if the plan was still forming. But Sunday was different. Sunday she walked out to the Shelby ranch in whatever weather the Kansas sky decided to offer, and she sat at Elijah's kitchen table and drank his coffee and asked him about Tommy's progress. And Elijah told her about it with a straightforward attention to detail that she came to love about him. The way he noticed things, the small things, the way Tommy had figured out on his own that the mare liked to be scratched behind her left ear. The way he had gotten up without being asked one morning when a calf got loose in the dark. "He is a good boy," Elijah said, the 3rd or 4th Sunday, with a simplicity that said he was not offering a polite assessment but an honest one. "He is," Florence said, and she looked at Elijah across the table and felt something warm and inconvenient beginning somewhere behind her sternum. She ignored it, because she was a practical woman and she had enough complicated things to manage without adding that particular complication. But it did not go away. Winter came across the Kansas plains like a slow, cold hand pressing down on everything, and the creek road became mud, and then ice, and Florence walked it anyway every Sunday in her heaviest coat with a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, arriving with her cheeks red and her boots caked. And Elijah always had coffee ready when she got there, which meant he was watching for her from the window. She noticed this at some point, and it made her feel something that she did not have a word for, the simple fact of being expected, of someone watching for you in the cold. One Sunday in January she arrived later than usual because the ice had made the road treacherous and she had slipped twice, and when she came through the ranch yard gate Elijah was already coming out of the barn toward her with his coat on and his face tight with something that might have been worry. "I was about to ride for you," he said. "The ice is bad," she said. "I am fine." He looked at her in that direct way of his, checking. "You are limping," he said. She was, because she had wrenched her ankle on the second slip, but she had not intended to mention it. "It is nothing." He did not argue with her. He simply held the door open, and then, without any further conversation, produced a basin of hot water and set it on the floor near the fire and looked at her until she sat down and pulled off her boot, which she did with considerable dignity and absolutely no acknowledgement that her ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Elijah looked at it. "You walked 4 miles on that." "I told you I was coming," Florence said, as if this explained everything, which to her it did. He wrapped it with strips of cloth from a clean shirt he cut without any apparent regret for the loss of the shirt, and his hands were very careful. And Florence looked at the fire while he worked and tried very hard not to notice the warmth of his hands, or the fact that he was kneeling on his own kitchen floor to tend to her ankle like it was the most natural thing in the world. Tommy was watching from the doorway to the hall with an expression that Florence recognized as the expression of someone trying very hard to look like they were not seeing anything significant. "Go on and feed the chickens," Elijah said to him without looking up. "I already fed them," Tommy said. "Feed them again," Elijah said. Tommy disappeared. The ankle took 2 weeks to fully heal. During those 2 weeks, Elijah drove into Caldwell every Sunday morning in his wagon and collected Florence and drove her back out to the ranch and drove her back to town in the late afternoon. He did not make a great production of this. He simply appeared at Mrs. Holt's door at 8 in the morning 2 Sundays in a row and handed Florence up onto the wagon seat and drove. And they talked, or they sat in a comfortable quiet that Florence had never had with anyone else. Not since her mother, and they arrived at the ranch with Tommy already up and making coffee and pretending that this arrangement was entirely expected. She began to know him during those drives. Not the broad strokes of him, those she had known from the beginning, his steadiness and his decency, and the way he treated her brother with the seriousness that Tommy deserved, but the smaller things. That he had been born in Tennessee, and had come west at 18 with a brother who had died of typhoid outside of Abilene, and that he had continued on alone because turning back had not seemed like it would honor anything. That he had built the ranch himself over 6 years, logging and laying adobe and hauling fence posts until his hands were permanently calloused, and he could not imagine any other pair of hands at the end of his wrists. That he had read every book on that shelf by the fireplace at least twice, and had opinions about them that were nothing like what you would expect a cattleman to have. "You read Dickens," Florence said one afternoon, turning a volume over in her hands. "Is that strange?" he said, from the doorway where he was pulling off his boots. "For a cattle rancher, a little," she said. "A man is more than his occupation," Elijah said, with a mildness that was not defensive at all, just simple and certain. Florence put the book back on the shelf and felt again that inconvenient warmth behind her sternum, and told herself firmly that she was grateful to this man, enormously grateful, and that gratitude was a respectable and sufficient feeling to have. By spring she had stopped believing herself. Spring came to Kansas like an argument that had been building all winter, loud and dramatic, with rainstorms that turned the creek road to rushing red mud and wildflowers exploding across the slopes behind the ranch in every direction. Tommy grew 2 inches, and his voice began to change in that unsettling way of 11-year-old boys moving toward 12, and he could handle most of the horses in the corral on his own, and had earned a small wage that he kept in a tin box under his bed with the seriousness of a banker. Florence watched all of this and felt a profound and complicated gratitude that had, by this point, entirely abandoned the pretense of being simply gratitude. She was in love with Elijah Shelby. She had been for some time. She simply had not told him, and she intended to keep not telling him, because the situation was delicate and the arrangement was working, and she could not afford, in any sense of the word, to upset it. The problem with being in love and saying nothing is that everything becomes a test of how well you can hold still. She held still through the spring cattle drive when Elijah came back from 3 weeks on the trail lean and tired, and sat at his own kitchen table like a man returning to something he had missed, and looked at her over his coffee cup with eyes that held something she told herself she was probably imagining. She held still through the afternoon in May when a thunderstorm rolled in faster than expected, and she was caught on the ranch road, and Elijah came out on horseback to find her, and she rode back behind him with her hands on his waist because there was nowhere else to put them, and she could feel through his coat the steadiness of him, the solid, reliable warmth of him, and she stared at the back of his rain-dark hat and held very, very still. She held still through the Sunday in June when Mrs. Holt, who was not an unobservant woman, said to Florence over the breakfast dishes, "You come back from that ranch looking different than you leave." "The walk is good for me," Florence said. Mrs. Holt smiled into the dishwater and did not say anything else. What finally made her stop holding still was not something she did at all. It was something Elijah did, and it happened in early July, in the middle of a cattle market dispute that had nothing romantic about it whatsoever. There was a man named Grover Prentice who ran the main cattle brokerage in Caldwell, and who had, for several seasons, been offering ranchers below market prices and keeping the difference as a private commission, which was known and resented widely but rarely challenged, because Prentice was connected to enough powerful men that challenging him seemed more trouble than the loss was worth. Elijah had been quietly building a case against him for 2 seasons, keeping records in a ledger in his desk, and in July he brought those records to the county land agent and the territorial representative who was visiting from Wichita. Florence knew about this because Elijah had told her, not as a confidential secret shared between close friends, but as information he trusted her to have, and that distinction mattered to her more than she could explain. He told her the way you tell someone who is part of your considerations. The day the meeting happened in town, Florence was working the morning breakfast service at Mrs. Holt's, and she saw Elijah come through the door of the boarding house's small dining room because Mrs. Holt's was where the county agent was staying. Elijah had his good coat on and his ledger under his arm, and he looked, in that particular morning light, like a man who had decided to do the right thing regardless of what it cost him. Florence poured his coffee and set it in front of him, and their hands were close on the table for a moment. "You be careful," she said, which was not what she had meant to say but was apparently what she had to say. Elijah looked at her with that direct brown gaze. "I will," he said, simply, like a promise. Prentice was found to have been defrauding ranchers systematically for 4 years. He lost his brokerage license before September. Several ranchers, Elijah among them, received partial restitution through the county process, which meant that the Shelby Ranch had a better autumn than it had had in years, and Elijah used part of the money to repair the roof of the house and part of it to buy Tommy a proper saddle of his own, which reduced Tommy temporarily to a state of speechlessness that Florence had never witnessed in him before. "You did not have to do that," Florence told Elijah the Sunday after the saddle appeared. "The boy has earned it," Elijah said. "He works as hard as any man I have employed." "He is 12 years old," Florence said. "He is nearly 13, Elijah said. "And he is your brother. That is recommendation enough." Florence looked at him across the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she had never in her life met a man like this one, and that she had been not telling him for the better part of a year, and that the not telling was beginning to feel dishonest in a way she could not excuse. But she still did not say it. Not that day. What she did instead was write it in a letter she had no intention of sending. She had been doing this for months, writing things down in the privacy of her small room at Mrs. Holt's, as a way of relieving pressure, the way you open a valve to keep a pipe from bursting. She wrote about the way he had cut up his shirt to wrap her ankle without a single comment about the loss of the shirt. She wrote about the drives in the wagon and the comfortable silences. She wrote about the look on his face when he talked about Tommy, a combination of genuine affection and gruff pride that was so unguarded it made her feel like she was seeing something private. She sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote his name on the outside and put it in the bottom of her carpetbag under everything else. Then the world, which had been relatively cooperative, decided to intervene. It was October when Mrs. Holt came to Florence with a face that said something difficult was coming. "I have to reduce my staff," Mrs. Holt said, and her eyes were genuinely sorry. "My son is coming from St. Louis with his family, and they will be taking the larger rooms, and with less revenue I cannot maintain the full wage. I am going to have to let you go by the end of the month, Florence. I wish it were otherwise." Florence received this information with the stillness she had developed over the past year, the ability to absorb a blow without showing the impact. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for telling me directly." She sat in her room that evening and thought carefully. She had saved a little money, not enough. She could look for work elsewhere in Caldwell. There was the hotel. There was the laundry that took commercial work. There were families who needed help. She could find something. She would find something. But it was Elijah who settled the question, and he did it without knowing he was doing it. The following Sunday she walked out to the ranch, and it was a beautiful October Sunday, the kind Kansas produces as an apology for its extremes, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bright yellow, and the air was cool and clean. She arrived to find Elijah and Tommy splitting wood for the winter, which Tommy was doing with enormous enthusiasm and middling accuracy, and Elijah correcting his swing with patient demonstration. She watched them from the gate for a moment before they saw her. The light was exactly right. Tommy's face was flushed with effort, and Elijah's was calm and attentive, and there was between them the ease of two people who had built a genuine regard for each other over the course of a year, and it hit Florence with a force she had not expected, that this was real, that what Elijah Shelby had given her brother was not charity or a convenient arrangement but actual care. And the understanding of what that meant and what she felt about it cracked something open in her chest that she was not sure she could close again. She told him about Mrs. Holt's news over coffee. She was matter-of-fact about it. She had options, she said. She would pursue them. Elijah set down his cup and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking properly. "I have a proposition," he said, and his voice was careful in a way that was different from his usual carefulness. "The house needs someone to run it properly, the cooking and the keeping of it. I have been managing on my own, and I do not manage it well. Tommy can tell you that." "It is true," Tommy said from his chair, where he had been pretending to read a book for the last 5 minutes. "I could pay a fair wage," Elijah said. "Better than the boarding house. And there is the room that Tommy is not using now since I gave him the back bedroom, which would be a proper space for you." A private room, everything above board and proper. Florence looked at him. His jaw was set in a way that said he had thought about this before today, which meant it was not an improvised rescue but a considered offer, and that distinction also mattered to her in a way she could not have explained to anyone. "You are offering me work," she said. "I am offering you work," he said. "You would not be obliged to stay longer than you wished. If you found something more suitable in town, you would be free to take it. It is simply that there is work here that needs doing and you need work to be done." Florence thought about the ride back to Caldwell that evening, alone on the road in the dark, and the small room at Mrs. Holt's that she would be leaving at the end of the month, and the hotel that might or might not have a position, and the laundry that smelled of lye from dawn to dusk. "All right," she said. I will take it. She moved onto the Shelby ranch the following Saturday, arriving with her carpetbag and 2 additional boxes she had accumulated over the year. And Tommy carried the boxes in with the great importance of someone performing a significant civic duty. The room was small and clean with a window that faced east, which meant morning light, and Florence put her mother's tin photograph on the little shelf above the washstand and looked at it for a moment. Clara Slater looked back from the photograph with the composed expression of someone who had sat very still for the required time, but there was something in her eyes that Florence had always read as satisfaction, the satisfaction of a woman who had raised 2 children to be decent people and was pleased about it. I hope this is all right, Florence said to the photograph, which was a habit she had developed after her mother died. She believed, without any solid evidence but with the certainty of someone who knew the person they were speaking to, that it was. Living on the ranch changed things in ways she had anticipated and ways she had not. She had anticipated the practical changes, the better cooking that improved immediately simply by having more time and resources to do it well, the order she brought to the house that made it lighter and more livable, the rhythm of days structured by the work of a household rather than the institutional schedule of a boarding house. She had not anticipated how it would feel to be present in Elijah's life in a daily way, to see him in the morning before he had fully composed himself for the day, to sit across from him at supper and hear about whatever had happened with the cattle, or the fences, or the negotiations with the neighboring Garrett ranch about the shared water rights. She had not anticipated how easy it would be to talk to him about real things, her plans to save enough money to eventually have something of her own, the books she was reading from his shelf by the fire in the evenings, the things she remembered about her mother that she had not told anyone since Missouri. She had not anticipated how badly she would want to tell him. November brought the first real cold, and with it a visit from Elijah's neighbor, a rancher named Cal Garrett, who came with his wife Eleanor and their 2 daughters for a Sunday dinner that Florence had cooked with some ambition. The Garretts were friendly people, the kind of straightforward frontier family that Florence liked, and Eleanor Garrett was sharp and warm in equal measure, and she helped Florence clear the dishes after dinner while the men talked cattle in the other room. "He talks about you," Eleanor said, setting plates on the counter with the ease of a woman comfortable in any kitchen. Florence kept her face arranged. "About my cooking, I expect." "Not only the cooking," Eleanor said pleasantly, and let it rest there. Florence did not ask what else. She was not sure she could hear the answer and continue behaving normally. But Eleanor Garrett had planted a seed that was harder to ignore than any seed Florence had planted in herself, because it was external information, not her own hoping, and it grew in the cold November dark with the persistence of something that intended to survive the season. Elijah began to bring her small things. She noticed this gradually, and then all at once, the way you notice a pattern only after you have already been looking at it for a while. A late apple from the last of the autumn tree, left on the kitchen windowsill, a piece of blue ribbon from the general store, tied around a small parcel of coffee he had brought back from town. One evening a book, set beside her place at the table with nothing said about it just there. She opened it and it was a novel she had mentioned, 3 weeks before, in passing, the kind of passing that people use when they do not believe they are being particularly heard. He had heard. She held the book and looked at the cover, and then looked at him across the table, and Elijah was looking at his supper, with a concentration that was slightly more intense than supper usually required. "Thank you," she said. "It was at the store," he said to his plate. "I happened to see it." "Of course," Florence said. Tommy looked between them with the knowing expression of a 13-year-old who has been observing a situation for the better part of a year and has formed very clear conclusions. December came, and with it a cold that settled into the bones of the house and the bones of the land and did not leave. Florence learned the rhythms of the ranch in winter, The way the animals needed earlier and more careful attention. The way the days closed in around the warmth of the house. She and Elijah and Tommy sat in the evenings by the fire, one of them reading aloud sometimes, or talking or playing cards. And it was so domestic and easy, and right that Florence sometimes had to remind herself it was not what it looked like from the outside. One evening in the middle of December, she was reading and Elijah was working on the harness leather at the other end of the table, and Tommy had gone to bed early because he had been out in the cold all day, and the house was quiet around them with the wind working at the windows. Florence turned a page and read the same paragraph for the third time without retaining a word of it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Elijah looked up. "Yes. Why did you do it?" she said. "Last year, when I came to your gate with nothing, why did you take Tommy without asking for much of anything in return?" Elijah set down the harness. He was quiet for a moment in the thoughtful way of him. "You came 4 miles in the dust to ask for help," he said, "and I could see what that cost you. A woman like you does not ask for help easily. And the boy was standing beside you looking like he had decided already that whatever you decided was right. I thought a person who would fight that hard and walk that far for someone else deserved someone to fight for them once." Florence looked at him. The fire was warm on her left side and the wind was at the windows, and she thought that she had been holding something in for 14 months and that it was becoming genuinely impossible to continue holding it. "Elijah," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had expected. "Florence," he said, "I wrote you a letter," she said. "Last summer I never sent it." He was very still. "What did it say?" She put the book down. "It said that I think about you every day. That I thought about you before I even lived here, every step of those 4 miles on Sunday mornings. It said that I have been grateful to you for Tommy, and grateful does not begin to cover it, but it also said something else that is not about gratitude at all." She watched him. "It said that I love you," she said. "That I think I have loved you for nearly a year, and that I did not tell you because I was afraid it would complicate everything you had built here, everything that was working for Tommy, and I could not risk that. But I am telling you now because it has become the truest thing I know, and keeping it to myself feels like a kind of dishonesty, and I cannot be dishonest with you." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the dark. Elijah stood up from his end of the table and came around it and sat in the chair beside her instead of across from her, and his face in the firelight was open in a way she had not quite seen before, something unguarded and clear. "I have been waiting," he said, "for what felt like a very long time to be certain I was not imagining things." "Were you imagining things?" she asked. "I was not," he said, "not even a little." He reached across and took her hand from where it rested on the closed book, and held it, not with the urgency of someone who had been waiting and was now finally acting, but with the quiet certainty of someone confirming something they have already known. And Florence felt the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of it, and thought that this was exactly what she had known he would be. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "So I will say it plainly. I love you, Florence Slater. I have admired you from the first day you came through that gate with your chin lifted, and your boots dusty, and your heart in your eyes even though you were trying to hide it. I have loved you since somewhere around January, I think, when you walked 4 miles on a sprained ankle because you had promised to come." She laughed, which she had not expected to do but which came out naturally and felt right. "That was rather stubborn," she said. "It was everything I admired about you," he said. They sat in the firelight with her hand in his and the wind moving outside and the house warm and quiet around them. And Florence thought that she had walked a long road to get to this kitchen table, measured in miles and in months, and in everything it had cost her and everything she had done, and all the things she had not said, and that the road had been entirely worth it. She would not have reached him any other way. Christmas at the Shelby Ranch was the best Christmas Florence could remember since her childhood, since before the war took their father, and before the lung fever took their mother. She cooked a proper dinner, and the Garrett family came, and several of Elijah's ranch hands came in from the bunkhouse, and the house was full of voices and warmth, and the smell of pine branches she and Tommy had cut and laid along the mantelpiece. Tommy received his gifts with the loud joy of a 13-year-old boy who has not yet learned to moderate his enthusiasm, and Florence did not want him to learn. Elijah had carved him a set of wooden horses, each one different, and Tommy lined them up on the kitchen windowsill with the precision of someone arranging something important. Elijah gave Florence the letter of his own that he had apparently been composing for about as long as she had been composing hers, which she read by the fire after the Garretts had gone and Tommy had gone to bed, and which made her cry quietly and happily into the fire warmth. It was a good letter. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he was an honest one, and honesty on the page had its own kind of poetry. She kept that letter in the bottom of the carpetbag, alongside the one she had written and never sent, and she considered them a correspondence of a very particular kind, between two people who had been saying everything to themselves for a long time before they found the courage to say it to each other. The spring of 1880 came in clean and warm and early, and Elijah Shelby asked Florence Slater to marry him on a Tuesday morning in March when she was standing at the kitchen counter cutting biscuits, and the sun was coming through the east window, and there was nothing remotely romantic about the circumstances, which somehow made it perfect. "I have been thinking," he said from the doorway. "About what?" she said, pressing the cutter into the dough. "About whether you would consider marrying me," he said. "I should have asked properly before now, but every time I thought about how to say it, I thought you would probably prefer I just said it plain." Florence set the biscuit cutter down and turned around. "You are right that I would prefer plain," she said. "Then will you," he said, "marry me? Be here properly, not because you need the work or because Tommy is here, but because you want to be." She crossed the kitchen floor and stood in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face the way she had done with Tommy at the end of that first terrible day, except entirely differently, and she looked at him. "There is nowhere else I want to be," she said. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment as if receiving something he had been holding his breath for, and then he opened them and smiled, which was not something Elijah Shelby did carelessly. And when he smiled fully, it changed his whole face, and Florence thought she could spend the rest of her life learning the terrain of that smile and not exhaust the subject. They told Tommy at breakfast, and Tommy received the news with a composure that lasted approximately 4 seconds before he knocked over his coffee cup in excitement, which he then tried to pretend had been an accident unrelated to the announcement. "I knew it," he said, righting the cup. "I knew it since January last year." "You knew nothing," Florence said. "I knew everything," Tommy said, with the sublime confidence of a 13-year-old who has been proven right about something important. The wedding was a simple ceremony in the church on the edge of Caldwell in April, with the Garrett family as witnesses and Mrs. Holt in her best dress and several of the ranch hands standing in a clean row in their good coats. Florence wore a dress she and Eleanor Garrett had made together from fabric she had saved for 6 months to buy, a blue-gray that Eleanor said brought out the color of her eyes, and that Florence simply thought was beautiful. Elijah at the altar wore his good coat and a clean white shirt and looked like himself, which was everything Florence had ever wanted, a man who stood in front of her and was simply, completely himself. The minister said the words and they said theirs, and when it was over and they stood together at the church door while everyone congratulated them, and the Kansas April sun came down warm and clear, Florence took Elijah's arm and looked out at the main street of Caldwell and felt something she recognized, with some surprise, as peace. She had not felt peace since before her mother's illness. She had not known she was carrying the absence of it until she felt its return. The ranch in the summer of 1880 was a different place from the ranch she had first come to as a stranger with dust on her boots and desperation in her heart. It was hers now, properly hers, and she moved through it with a comfort that was not complacency but a deep, grounded contentment, the contentment of someone who has worked very hard for something real. She planted a proper kitchen garden and grew tomatoes and beans and squash that came in heavy and good. She kept books for the ranch alongside Elijah's own records, and discovered that she had a head for figures that she had never had occasion to use before. And Elijah received this discovery with the matter-of-fact appreciation of a man who recognizes usefulness and does not make a gender-based assessment of where it comes from. "You are better at the column figures than I am," he said one evening, looking at the ledger she had reorganized. "I expect I am," Florence said pleasantly. He grinned. "You could at least pretend to be modest." "You married me for my practical nature," she said. "It would be dishonest to suddenly pretend to false modesty." He pulled her close by the hand she was using to hold the pen and kissed her temple, which did not contribute to the accuracy of the ledger, but was a contribution of a different kind. Tommy, 14 now and growing fast, moved through the ranch with the ease of someone who has lived somewhere long enough to know it in his bones. He was genuinely good with the horses, better than any of the hired hands at reading their moods and movements, and Elijah had begun to talk about what that might mean for the future of the ranch, whether there might be a breeding operation in it, whether Tommy's particular gift might be the foundation of something. Florence listened to these conversations between the man she had married and the boy she had raised and felt a specific kind of happiness that she thought probably did not have a name, because it was too particular. The happiness of watching two people you love regard each other with genuine respect and mutual benefit. The happiness of a family that has been built from pieces that did not start together, but have fitted themselves into something solid. Not everything in those years was smooth. The frontier was not a smooth place, and did not pretend to be. There was the summer drought of 1881 that turned the grass brown and made the cattle thin, and required 3 months of careful rationing and borrowed goodwill from the Garretts. There was the illness that took 2 of the young cattle horses in the same week in autumn of that year, which was a financial loss that hurt, and which Elijah bore with a practical grief that Florence recognized as the grief of a man whose animals are not merely property. There was the matter of Florence's own grief, which had never fully resolved itself but had settled into something livable. She found in the 2nd year of her marriage a Sunday habit of visiting her mother's grave, which was back in Missouri and could not be visited in any literal way. So instead she visited the idea of it from the ranch porch in the early morning before anyone else was awake, with a cup of coffee and the tin photograph. And she talked out loud about the week and the ranch and Tommy's progress and Elijah. And she believed, still with her whole heart, that her mother heard every word. "You would have liked him," she said on one of those mornings, to the photograph and the early light and the silence. "He is a good man, Mama. He is the best man I have ever known, and I know you would have seen it immediately." The spring of 1882 brought Florence a new thing to talk to her mother about. She discovered she was expecting a child in April, confirmed by the doctor in Caldwell who had the decency to treat her with straightforward professionalism, and she walked the road back to the ranch in the April morning with the news settled inside her like a stone in warm water, heavy and real, and more enormous than she had words for. Elijah was at the corral gate when she came up the road, which she had come to understand was simply where he appeared when she had been gone longer than expected, not because he was anxious but because he liked to see her arriving. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him, and he looked back with that attentive brown gaze, reading her face. "What?" he said. "We are going to have a baby," she said. The thing that happened to his face was the best thing she had ever seen. Not surprise exactly, or not only surprise, but a kind of flooding, like something released that had been dammed. And he put both hands on her face the way she had put her hands on his at the altar, and he held her face and looked at her with everything unguarded. "Florence," he said, which was all, but it was enough. She pressed her hands over his, and they stood in the ranch yard in the April morning with the horses moving behind the fence and the Kansas sky enormous and blue above them, and they breathed. Tommy, summoned from the barn by some instinct, appeared in the barn doorway. "What happened?" he demanded. "You are going to be an uncle," Florence said. The look on Tommy's face at 16 was not unlike the look Tommy at 13 had worn when he first saw the saddle Elijah had given him, the look of someone presented with more good fortune than they had known to expect. He recovered quickly. "I knew it," he said. "You did not know anything," Florence said. "I knew everything," Tommy said, and went back into the barn, and she could hear him, quite clearly, laughing. Florence's pregnancy was not an easy one in its first months. She was sick in the mornings with a thoroughness that was impressive and exhausting, and Elijah managed the early mornings of the household without complaint, producing coffee and plain bread, and a patience that never once wavered. And she accepted both the care and the patience with the gratitude of someone who has learned that being helped by someone who loves you is not weakness, but its own kind of gift. By autumn she was well, and the baby was moving, and she had let out all her dresses, and was reading every book she could find about what was coming, because Florence Slater Shelby was a woman who prepared. The baby came in December of 1882, a boy, born in the bedroom with the east window during a snowstorm that filled the silence outside with the sound of itself. The midwife from Caldwell, a Cheyenne woman named Nane who had been delivering babies in the county for 20 years, presided with the calm authority of long experience. Elijah stayed in the kitchen in a state of controlled worry that Tommy told him, helpfully, was visible through the wall. "How would you know what my worry looks like through a wall?" Elijah said. "You are very loud when you are quiet," Tommy said, which was exactly accurate. The baby was born healthy and strong, and Florence held him and looked at his small, perfect, entirely self-important face, and felt a love so large it seemed physiologically impossible to contain in one person. Elijah came in when Nane allowed it, which was approximately 30 seconds after the sound of crying started. He stood in the doorway and looked at Florence and the baby, and Florence had never seen him look like this, had never imagined this exact expression on this particular face, something entirely new, something that had not existed before this moment. "Come here," she said. He came and sat beside her, and she placed the baby in his arms, and he held their son with a carefulness that was entirely unlike his usual confident handling of things, careful the way you handle something irreplaceable, and looked down at him. "He looks like you," Elijah said. "He absolutely does not," Florence said. "He looks like a very small old man." "A very small old man who looks like you," Elijah said, which made her laugh despite herself. They named him James Elijah Shelby, James for nobody in particular, but because it was a solid name that seemed to suit him, and Elijah for the man who had made his existence possible in all the ways that mattered. Tommy met his nephew with the tender astonishment of a young man encountering something that rearranges his understanding of the world. And from the first day, he was the most dedicated uncle that had ever existed in the county, which was saying something because the county contained a number of generally conscientious people. James Shelby was 6 months old when Nane, who had become a regular visitor at the ranch during the pregnancy and after, made a remark during one of her Sunday afternoon visits that Florence had been thinking about for some time anyway. "The county has no proper midwife for the northern settlements," Nane said, over tea. "I am getting older and my territory is too large. There are women having babies up in the creek settlements with no one." Florence looked at her. "I have been thinking about training," she said, "properly, whatever I can learn." "I will teach you," Nane said. "What I know is worth passing." It was not a simple thing to undertake with a baby and a ranch and a household to manage, but Florence had never been deterred by things not being simple, and Elijah, who was entirely unsurprised by this development, arranged the household to allow for it with the practical flexibility of a man who knows his wife's capabilities exceed any one role. She began riding out with Nane that summer, learning first to observe and then to assist and then, gradually, to act. And Nane was a demanding and excellent teacher who never complimented needlessly and whose approval, when it came, was exactly as valuable as it was rare. There were things Florence encountered on those rides that showed her, more clearly than her own experience had, the hardships that the frontier inflicted on people who did not have what she had. Women alone with children. Families in poverty so deep it had become invisible to them. Children who would not make it. Injustices so baked into the structure of the place that they barely registered as injustices anymore. People like Nane, whose knowledge and skill were used by the community, and whose authority was routinely questioned by men who knew half what she did, because of who she was and where she had come from. Florence registered all of it. She brought it home to the kitchen table, and she and Elijah talked about it with the same directness they brought to the cattle records and the water rights, because they were two people who had agreed early on that the world was more honest when you looked at it directly. "She knows more than the doctor in Caldwell," Florence said once, about Nane. "She has been doing this longer, and yet he dismisses her. He is afraid of her," Elijah said, which was probably true and not sufficient excuse. "It is not right," Florence said. "No," Elijah said, "it is not." They could not fix the large injustices, but they did what they could in the smaller radius of their own lives, which was to pay Nane fairly for her teaching, to advocate in town for her standing when the opportunity arose, and to treat her with the respect that was her due. In the spring of 1884, Tommy turned 18. Florence made him a dinner, and Elijah gave him an additional horse from the ranch stock, a 3-year-old gray that Tommy had been admiring since the autumn. And Tommy received both with the dignity of someone trying very hard to be an adult about receiving gifts, while privately feeling exactly as delighted as he had at 13. After dinner, when James was in bed and the dishes were done, and the three of them were sitting in the firelight, Tommy said something that Florence had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. "I have been thinking about going north," he said. "There is a horse ranch in Wyoming that has been mentioned to me. They are known for their breeding program. I thought I might write and ask about work." The kitchen was quiet. "That sounds like a good opportunity," Elijah said. "Wyoming is far," Florence said, and then immediately, "That sounds like a good opportunity." Tommy looked between them. "I am not leaving forever," he said. "You cannot get rid of me that easily. I just think I want to see something I have not seen, and learn from people who know more than I do about the breeding side of things." Florence looked at her brother, this tall young man who had been 11 years old and clinging to her skirt in the dust of Caldwell almost 6 years ago, and she thought that growing up was the thing you wanted for them and the thing that was hardest to receive. "Write the letter," she said. "And if they want you, go. We will be here." Tommy went north in June of 1884, with his gray horse and his saddle, and a bag that was considerably better packed than the carpetbag Florence had arrived with in 1878. He embraced Florence for a long time in the ranch yard and shook Elijah's hand, and then pulled him into an embrace as well briefly, with the slightly awkward intensity of a young man who has been raised to be unsentimental, but is feeling very sentimental. "Take care of her," Tommy said to Elijah, which was unnecessary because no one on earth needed to say this to Elijah Shelby. "I intend to," Elijah said. Florence watched Tommy ride north out of the ranch gate and kept her composure until the road curved and he disappeared behind the cottonwoods, and then she sat down on the porch step, and Elijah sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders and did not say anything, which was exactly right. "He will be all right," she said, after a while. "He will be extraordinary," Elijah said, with the confidence of a man who has watched a boy grow for 5 years and knows exactly what he is capable of. James was 2 years old and walking with the fearless conviction of a toddler, who has no clear understanding of what the word danger means. He had his father's brown eyes and his mother's particular chin, and he had decided that horses were his primary interest in life, which given the household he had been born into was not surprising but was, Florence thought, perhaps premature for someone who had only been walking for 4 months. Elijah took him into the corral on a quiet mare, seated in front of him, and James put his small hands on the horse's neck with the reverence of someone touching something sacred, and Florence watched from the fence rail with her heart in her throat the way it always was and always would be when James did something new. "He will be fine," Elijah said. "You always say that," Florence said. "He always is," Elijah said. "The years built on each other in the good way, the way of years that have been properly inhabited." The ranch grew steadily, the cattle operation expanding as Elijah's reputation for fair dealing and well-managed stock attracted buyers who returned season after season. Florence's work with Non-A developed into something that served the northern settlements reliably, and that had, by the time James was 4, delivered over 30 babies and attended a great many more. She was known in the county in her own right, not as Elijah Shelby's wife, but as Florence Shelby, who you sent for when you needed someone capable. She had not thought, when she was standing in the Caldwell dust with $3.40 and a carpetbag, that any of this was possible. She had thought about surviving. She had thought about keeping Tommy fed and safe. She had thought about getting through the week. She thought about this sometimes, about how much you cannot see from the bottom of a difficult year, how the road ahead is dark in a way that the road behind never is, and she was grateful for the darkness, because if she had known then what she knew now, she might not have believed it. And if she had not believed it, she might not have walked through Elijah Shelby's gate and asked for help, and let her life begin becoming what it was. A letter arrived from Tommy in October of 1885, written in his large, energetic handwriting on good paper, which said that he was well and that the Wyoming operation was excellent, and that he had learned more about breeding in 18 months than he could have imagined. And also, parenthetically, as if he were mentioning the weather, that he had met a young woman named Clara, and that she was from a ranching family, and that he thought Florence would like her very much. Florence read this line 3 times and then showed it to Elijah, who read it once. "Clara," he said. "He named her Clara," Florence said, which was not quite what she meant, but Elijah understood what she meant because he understood what her mother's name was and why it mattered. "He found someone good," Elijah said. "He would," Florence said. "He knows what good looks like." She wrote Tommy a letter in return that ran to 4 pages and contained the full measure of her feelings about this development, which she would not summarize because it was private, and also a detailed list of questions about Clara that Tommy would predictably refuse to answer in the detail she wanted, and a clear statement that they were to come south for Christmas and she would not hear otherwise. They came. Tommy arrived 3 weeks before Christmas with Clara on his arm, a quiet young woman of 19 with red hair and steady gray eyes who looked at Tommy the way Florence had looked at Elijah, with the particular kind of looking you do when you cannot quite believe your luck. Florence loved her within the first hour. Clara helped in the kitchen without being asked and talked about horses with a knowledge that surprised even Elijah, and she played on the floor with James with total unself-consciousness. And in the evenings she sat with Tommy in the firelight and Florence watched them together and felt that specific happiness again, the one without a name. On Christmas morning, in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, Tommy gave Clara a ring that he had made by the jeweler in Cheyenne, a small turquoise stone set in silver that caught the morning light. Florence was the only one present for this because she had gotten up early as she always did, and Tommy looked at her over Clara's bent head as Clara said yes, and his face was the face of the boy at the gate who had decided that whatever Florence decided was right, except grown up and certain and happy. "Well done," Florence said. "I learned from the best," Tommy said. She threw a kitchen towel at him because she was not prepared to cry before 7 in the morning. They were married the following spring in Wyoming, and Florence and Elijah and James made the journey north, which was James's first significant adventure, and which he approached with the seriousness of a 4-year-old conducting important research. The wedding was outdoors on the Wyoming ranch, the mountains in the distance and the spring sky enormous, and Tommy at the altar looked like a man who has arrived somewhere he has been traveling toward his whole life. "Your mother would have been so happy," Florence told him afterward. "She is," Tommy said, with the same quiet certainty she had always had herself, the certainty of people who know their loved ones have not entirely departed. In the summer of 1886, Florence was expecting again. This one easier than James had been. The pregnancy settled and calm from the beginning, as if the baby had decided not to cause unnecessary difficulty. She continued her work with Nane through the first months because she was capable of it, and because there were people who needed her. And Nane accepted this without comment, because Nane had never been under the illusion that pregnancy reduced a woman's abilities. Florence rode carefully and carried what she could, and the summer moved around her in the good, unhurried way of a Kansas summer that has decided to be generous. Elijah brought her water when she was working in the garden and stood over her with a care that was slightly excessive and that she called him on. "I am pregnant," she said. "I am not made of glass." "I know that," he said. "I am standing here because I want to." She looked at him standing in the garden with the sun on him and the grassland rolling out behind the fence, and thought for the 100th time that she had been so close, so many times, to not saying anything, to continuing to hold it in behind practical gratitude and sensible caution, and that the letter she had written and never sent had almost stayed unsent, and that everything, every good thing, had come from finally saying it out loud. "Come here," she said, and when he crouched beside her in the garden she kissed him, which startled him slightly because she was not usually demonstrative in the outdoors where the hands might see, and she did not care today. "What was that for?" he said. "Because I love you," she said, "and because you stood at that gate with your hammer and your patient eyes and you changed everything and you did not even know you were doing it." He looked at her in that way he had, the way that still made her feel precisely seen. "You changed everything," he said. "Not me. You walked through the gate." She put her dirty gardening hand on his cheek and left a smear of Kansas soil there that he did not wipe off. The second baby came in November, another boy, and they named him Daniel Thomas Shelby. Daniel because Florence had always liked the name, and Thomas for the brother who had grown up decent and good, and who received the news via letter with a response that arrived by return post and was only 3 lines long. "Clara is with child in February. Our children will be cousins and the best of friends. Well done, Florence." Florence read this at the kitchen table and laughed until she had to put it down. The ranch in the winter of 1886 into 1887 was full in a way that Florence had not anticipated when she had first looked at the clean, quiet order of it 7 years before. James at 4 was a clear and certain personality, interested in everything that moved, deeply attached to his father and deeply attached to his mother in the different ways that children attach to each parent. Daniel was an infant who had opinions about his schedule that he communicated at volume, and who was already showing signs of his mother's particular chin and his father's brown eyes. Nane came to dinner on Sundays sometimes, and sat by the fire after and talked about the things she had seen over her decades in the county, the changes and the failures to change, and the small victories that accumulated without ever quite adding up to the thing you hoped for. Florence listened with the attention she brought to everything important and thought about the world she wanted her sons to grow up in and what it would take to get there. Not everything you wanted would come in your lifetime. That was also something the frontier taught you, the understanding of what patience in the largest sense actually required. But some things came. Tommy came back for good in the spring of 1888, with Clara, who was pregnant with their second child, the first having been a girl named Clara Rose, who was 18 months old and already possessed of her father's complete confidence in her own assessment of any situation. They settled on a piece of land adjacent to the Shelby Ranch, which Elijah had arranged the purchase of, and which Tommy had protested for approximately 1 afternoon, before admitting that he could not think of anywhere he would rather build. He built his house over the summer, and Florence watched it go up from her kitchen garden, with a satisfaction she did not have words for, the satisfaction of watching someone you love put down roots in the same earth you have put yours into. The Shelby Ranch became, in time, 2 ranches sharing a fence line and a water arrangement, and Sunday dinners that grew louder and more complicated every year as children multiplied and grew and made themselves known. James turned 8 and began attending school in Caldwell with a seriousness that suggested he intended to master it efficiently and move on to whatever came next. Daniel was a different creature entirely, more patient and more watchful, the kind of child who needed to understand the whole of something before he would commit to an opinion. Florence watched both of them and thought that she understood each of them, and that this was one of the strangest and most complete gifts that life had offered her, to know her children, to see them clearly, to love them in the particular way each one needed, and not in some generic version of love that served the parent more than the child. She had learned that from being loved properly herself, from being seen by a man who had looked at her directly from the first day and never looked at her any other way. Elijah at 38 was a man well established in his land and his work and himself, which was not a common thing, and Florence knew it, and she did not take it for granted even for a day. He was still the same man who had crouched in his own kitchen floor to wrap her ankle, who had put books beside her place at the table, who had stood at his gate and watched for her in the cold. He was only more himself now, deeper in it, the way a good piece of wood gets richer over years. She was 32, and she was different too, more herself than she had been at 22, more settled in the person she had become. She was a rancher's wife and a midwife and a mother and a daughter in spirit and a sister in fact and a friend to several good people. And she held all of these things at once in the particular competence of a woman who has learned that she is larger than any single version of herself. One evening in the autumn of 1888, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the fire was low, Florence went to the bottom of the carpetbag that lived under the bed, still her carpetbag from the Caldwell stage, sentimental only because of what it had held. She took out the envelope with Elijah's name on the outside and the one from him that she had kept alongside it, and she brought them to the kitchen table. He was sitting with his coffee, reading, and he looked up when she set the envelopes on the table between them. "What are those?" he said. "This one is the letter I wrote you and never sent," she said. "Last summer, 1879, before I told you." He looked at it. "You still have it." "I do." "And that one?" He nodded at the second envelope. "Yours," she said. "The one you wrote me at Christmas." He was quiet a moment. "What would you like to do with them?" Florence looked at both envelopes on the table in the firelight, the months of kept silence they represented, all the things she had known and not said, and the things he had known and not said, and everything that had happened because two people had finally been honest with each other and changed the whole direction of their lives. "I thought we might read them," she said, out loud, to each other. Elijah looked at her with those brown eyes that still, 10 years later, saw her completely. "All right," he said. She picked up her own envelope and unfolded the letter, and she read it aloud in the warm kitchen of their house, the house that was hers as much as his now, in the land they had worked together for a decade, with the children sleeping in the rooms above and the fire settling into its coals. She read about the 4-mile walks on Sunday mornings and the ankle and the rides in the wagon and the book left by her place at the table. She read the sentence about loving him, which sounded different out loud than it had on paper, more certain, more present. Then she set it down and he picked up his own envelope and read his letter to her, and it was everything she had hoped it would be, plain and honest and exactly him, the way a man who does not say things he does not mean says things he means. When he had finished, they sat in the quiet for a moment. "We were very foolish," Florence said. "We were very careful," Elijah said. "That is not the same thing." "Why did you wait so long to say it?" she asked. "If you knew." "Because you had already asked for so much help," he said, "and I did not want you to think I was offering something and attaching a condition to it. The arrangement with Tommy had to stand on its own without anything complicated beneath it. I wanted you to know you were safe here before I asked you to be anything more." Florence looked at him. The fire was warm. Outside, the Kansas night was deep and still and cold. "That is," she said, "the most like you thing you have ever said." "Is that a criticism?" he said. "It is the furthest thing from a criticism," she said. She put both letters in the fire, one after the other, which was not something she had planned to do, but which felt right, the way some ceremonies feel right when they are happening even if you did not design them. They burned cleanly and quickly, and the smoke went up the chimney, and the letters were gone, and the things they had contained were not gone because they were already here, already real, already lived. She moved from her chair to his, and he made room for her the way he always did, without needing to be asked, and she leaned her head against his shoulder with the fire low and the house quiet and the land dark and vast outside the windows. "Elijah," she said. "Florence," he said. "I am very glad I walked through your gate," she said. His arm tightened around her shoulders, and she felt him breathe, slow and even, the breath of a man who is entirely where he wants to be. "I am very glad you did," he said. "Every day. I am glad every day." Outside, the Kansas stars were out in their thousands over the dark prairie, the same stars that had hung over the Kisham Trail when this was all cattle drives and dust, the same stars that would hang there long after all the particular lives played out beneath them. But for now they shone over the Shelby ranch, where 2 boys slept in their rooms and a garden was ready for the spring, and a horse barn held good animals, and the lamp in the kitchen window burned the way lamps burn in houses where people have chosen to be. Tommy's son was born in February of 1889, as promised, a boy they named Elijah Thomas Garrett, which everyone agreed was a fine name for a boy who would grow up between 2 good ranches with more horses than he knew what to do with, and 2 families who had been built from the ground up by people willing to walk through difficult gates. Florence delivered him herself, which Nane had trained her for, and which Clara had requested with the specific confidence of a woman who knows who she wants in the room when things matter. It was a long night and a good one, and when the baby was safely arrived and Florence had cleaned her hands and Tom was in the room with his wife and son wearing the face of a man entirely undone by love, Florence stepped outside the house into the February dark and stood in the cold air and looked at the stars and breathed. She heard footsteps behind her and knew them before she turned. Elijah came and stood beside her, his coat over his shoulders, holding out hers. "He is well," he said. "He is perfect," she said, taking the coat. 7 pounds and angry about being born, which suggests good health. Elijah smiled into the dark. Florence put her arm through his and they stood in the cold looking at the stars over the range, the distant sound of cattle settling in the night, the smell of frost and dry grass and home. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about Caldwell and the stage and $3.40, and the letter she had never sent and the ankle wrapped in a good shirt, and the 4-mile walks in all weathers and the letter placed beside her plate at supper and all of it, the whole road of it, leading here. "I am thinking," she said, "that it is a very good world." He covered her hand with his where it rested in the crook of his arm, and they stood together under the winter stars while inside the house a new life had just begun, and the prairie spread away from them in every direction, old and patient and enormous, and all around them were the lives they had built from nothing but willingness and honesty and the courage to walk through gates. "It is," Elijah Shelby said, looking out at all of it. "It really is." And Florence leaned into his shoulder in the cold dark and believed him completely, because he had never once said a thing he did not mean.